Our story begins with a man who has a peculiar habit. He only buys damaged goods. The more expensive and shattered they are, the better, leading everyone to whisper behind his back. They called him a fool, but little did they know, this was his secret to gaining power. However, while he was busy collecting these broken items, disaster struck. He accidentally shattered the young mistress's precious jade cup and was sentenced to 4 days of fasting in the woodshed. The manager, Song Yun, looked at his disheveled state with disdain. Song Yun delivered the news. Once the fasting ended, he was to be sent to the trash room. For a servant, this meant the end of any future. To be honest, it was a harsh sentence. The manager expected him to collapse in despair, but instead, he simply thanked the young mistress for her grace. Song Yun clenched his fists, frustrated by such calm indifference. He reminded the man that the second miss had been at the immortal sect for 3 years without writing home. Why would she remember a mere servant? He told him to rot there and left. He slammed the door shut, never imagining that this punishment was exactly what our protagonist wanted. The trash room was quiet and filled with broken treasures, a perfect sanctuary. For him, it was an ideal destination, though he first had to survive the hunger. 3 days later, just as he was reaching his limit, the second miss's maid, Xiaokai, appeared. Xiaokai had waited until the guards relaxed to bring him some warm buns. She urged him to eat quickly, but in a surprising turn of events, he actually refused the food. He told himself it was better not to eat, as his release was only a day away and he didn't want any complications. Besides, he had a much more important request for her. He asked if Xiaokai could help him retrieve the fragments of that broken jade cup. Without asking questions, she agreed and hurried away into the shadows. However, he had no idea that the eldest miss, Song Lingxue, was standing in a dark corner, watching Xiaocai's every move with a cold, calculating gaze. Song Yun approached her, concerned for her health in the cold night air, but Lingxue remained unmoved. Her expression was as icy as the wind around them. She asked what the servant had said when he was punished. Song Yun replied that he had thanked her for her grace. Lingxue let out a cold laugh, calling him a good dog. She turned and walked away. As the sole pillar of the Song family, she needed a husband to marry into the house, but she found it impossible to trust outsiders. Only our protagonist's striking looks had ever caught her eye, but after several failed attempts to test him, her patience had finally run out. If he was unwilling, she wouldn't force him. She didn't realize, of course, that a transformation was about to occur that she could never have predicted. At that moment, a countdown in his mind finally reached 0. His restoration ability had finally refreshed. To his surprise, the breathing technique he discovered shared similarities with an ancient pre-Qin qi refining method from his past life. He immediately sat up to begin his practice. He attempted to capture the energy of heaven and earth, but after 2 hours of meditation, he had gained nothing. And yet, just as he relaxed, something shifted. As we glance at the interface in his mind, we see something that makes him freeze, a new restoration option for a foundational qi refining technique. It seemed his earlier efforts weren't entirely in vain. The next evening, after finishing his meal, he was finally escorted to the trash room. The room was piled high with ancient, dusty junk, yet he couldn't have been more satisfied. While waiting for his restoration count to refresh, a sudden knock came at the door. Xiaokai arrived, looking quite flustered as she handed him a cloth bag containing all the fragments. He let out a sigh of relief, promising to repay her kindness one day. Not daring to linger, Xiaokai hurried away into the night. He closed the door and opened the bag, immediately feeling a surge of information flood his mind. This was a Lin Jade cup, an immortal gift capable of gaining sentience if nurtured for years. It was a pity he had broken it, but fortunately, the pieces were all there. Surprisingly, he didn't plan to use his interface to fix it. This cup was the most precious item he had ever touched, and he had a much grander purpose for it. The following day, he spent his time cleaning the trash room before heading into town to buy restoration materials. It took until dusk to gather everything he needed. Just as he returned to the Song Manor, he overheard some truly exciting news. The second miss, who hadn't been heard from in years, had finally returned home. Driven by an intense curiosity about cultivation, he realized the second miss was his only link to that world. He hurried toward the main hall, hoping for a chance. However, he came to a sudden halt in the corridor. In his excitement, he had forgotten his place. Without a formal summons, a servant had no right to enter the main hall. Just as he was about to give up on this risky venture, the eldest miss and her entourage rounded the corner. And this is where things got truly strange. With just one glance at the man walking beside her, he felt his body instinctively bow his head. There was no doubt about it. This man was a true immortal. He quickly stepped aside to clear the path. To his surprise, the eldest miss, Song Lingxue, studied him for a moment before letting out a soft, dismissive sigh. She mentioned that her sister had just been asking about him and told him to come inside. She then turned to the man with a graceful, apologetic look. She apologized to Immortal Qin for the lack of discipline in the manor. Qin Feng simply shook his head, remaining silent, yet his presence was terrifyingly overwhelming. Once they entered the hall, we see the second miss, Song Lingqing, looking at him with confusion. She clearly didn't recognize the disheveled servant standing in the corner. He offered a respectful greeting, and after a brief nod from Lingqing, he wisely retreated to the shadows without trying to force a conversation. As everyone sat down, the atmosphere should have been celebratory, yet the head of the house, Song Tonghai, looked deeply troubled as he addressed Ling Qing. He asked when they had to leave, worried that staying longer might delay their journey. Ling Qing replied that the Great Sect competition was still nearly 10 years away. Song Tonghai's face lit up with joy at her words, but Ling Qing's tone shifted abruptly as she explained that Mingwei would soon have to depart for the distant Hell Realm where the competition is held. The journey was far, and she needed to reserve ample time for her own cultivation. 10 years was barely enough. As she spoke, a flicker of worry crossed her eyes. The movements of the sect's true disciples were absolute secrets. If she hadn't pleaded with Uncle Qin, he never would have brought her home, so she begged her father to keep her presence quiet. Tonghai gave a reassuring smile, noting he had already issued a gag order, so she could focus on bringing glory to the sect. At this, the shadows in Ling Qing's eyes finally began to lift. Meanwhile, Qin Feng remained as silent as a statue, not uttering a single word. It wasn't until nightfall that the gathering finally concluded and the guests departed. Back in his room, however, our protagonist found himself unable to sleep. He had gathered very little information. Tonghai seemed to have a hidden plan and hadn't even asked about his daughter's life at the sect. Ling Qing, for her part, hadn't volunteered any details either. Just as he was sinking into frustration, a sudden voice called out from beyond his door. It was the second Miss herself. His heart began to race. To be honest, he never expected the opportunity he just missed to come knocking on his door so soon. She wasted no time in revealing her true purpose for coming. She told him that since he had served her for years, she wished to grant him a single wish today. His eyes brightened instantly, and he nearly asked for his freedom right then and there. But he caught himself. Compared to the secrets of the immortal sects, his current predicament as a servant seemed trivial, and so he decided to take a much bigger gamble. He told her he simply wanted some ancient texts from the immortal sections. Ling Qing's brow furrowed in confusion, as this was certainly not the request she expected from a servant. She reminded him that without an immortal artifact, he couldn't draw qi into his body. Wealth or a beautiful wife, those were the things a servant usually craved. But his next words caught her completely off guard. He insisted he didn't want a cultivation method. He only wanted any records or books related to the immortal world. Ling Qing couldn't help but offer a stern warning. She told him that knowing of things he could never touch might bring him a lifetime of misery. Yet, hearing this, he actually felt a sense of relief. It seemed these books weren't guarded secrets if she was willing to share them. He looked her in the eye and said he simply wanted to see the world for what it truly was. Ling Qing nodded and ultimately left him with 4 ancient texts. She had no way of knowing, of course, that this simple decision would nearly cost him his life. Once she was gone, he used all of his restoration charges for the day on the Great Cycle Qi technique. He was betting everything on the interface in his mind. He had never intended to ask for a standard cultivation method. Instead, he placed his hopes on the immortal Loot Qi method. If a genius like Ling Qing thought he couldn't cultivate, then the normal path was a dead end. There was no point wasting energy on the impossible. Sure enough, as he flipped through the texts, he discovered a harsh truth about the world of immortals. Cultivation required immortal bones to act as a medium for worldly qi. Only then could one reach the power-nourishing stage and live for over 150 years. Once the power-nourishing stage reaches its limit, the Dantian generates mana, leading to the Spirit Spring realm and a lifespan of 300 years. He read until dawn. He reluctantly set down the ancient texts, his heart swelling with anticipation. He couldn't help but wonder if the immortal Loot Qi method would truly be his salvation. He had no idea, of course, that a massive crisis was already looming. Less than 2 days after Ling Qing's departure, King Guanyun suddenly sent a carriage full of lavish gifts. Although the Song family resided within King Guanyun's territory, there had never been any formal contact between them. Why the sudden generosity? And that wasn't all. Gift lists from various noble families and powerful gangs began to pour in. It seemed the secret of Ling Qing's return had leaked out to the entire world. The main hall was now a whirlwind of political maneuvering and unexpected visitors. Our protagonist, however, remained utterly indifferent to these external storms. All of his focus was poured into the restoration of the immortal loot. Using a specially prepared solution, he carefully coated the reassembled pieces. A moment later, a sudden notification echoed within his mind. The interface informed him that his painstaking efforts had improved his skills. Looking at his restorer experience, which now sat at 32 points, a flash of joy crossed his eyes. 5 restoration charges per day were simply too few. He knew he had to level up his restorer rank quickly, but his moment of triumph was cut short. The next day, an uninvited guest arrived at the lonely waste room. Song Yun had already interrogated 6 people in just a few days, and now he was here. He had only intended to perform a routine check, but he never expected to find such an accidental harvest. The ancient texts were quickly discovered. Ling Qing had left in such a hurry that she hadn't informed the household of her gift. To anyone else, it was impossible for a mere servant to possess such books. And so, he found himself locked in the woodshed once again. Song Yun reported everything, including the protagonist's recent suspicious movements, to the eldest sister, Song Linxue. Linxue stared at him with a dark, brooding expression, demanding to know why he had been sneaking out and if he had secret contacts outside the manor. He He kept his composure and told her the truth, or at least, a version. He explained that he had only gone out to purchase specific restoration materials. Lin Shua looked at him with genuine confusion. She couldn't understand why he hadn't used his one wish to ask for gold, his freedom, or even a life-extending pill. His response, however, caught everyone completely off guard. He told her that since his parents died when he was young, the Song family was the only home he had ever known. He looked up at Lin Shua and claimed that since he had broken the immortal lute, he deserved death, and his only wish was to make amends to the family. He told her that since she had been kind enough to spare his life, he was determined to repay that debt. To be honest, his predecessor had been rather ungrateful. The eldest miss had offered her favor many times, only to be rejected. But he knew that a real man knows when to bow. After all, pride isn't worth a penny. As he spoke with such apparent sincerity, Song Yun felt a surge of alarm. This was certainly not the man she knew, and she quickly glanced toward Song Lin Shua. We see that Lin Shua's gaze had already softened. In that moment, Song Yun broke into a cold sweat. The old version of him was just a handsome shell, never a threat. But this new version made her feel a strange sense of danger. Lin Shua, however, decided he had simply learned his lesson and told Song Yun that her business there was done. Lin Shua waved her hand dismissively, telling him he could keep the books since her sister had given them to him. He breathed a sigh of relief, thanking her for her insight. He was just about to turn and leave when she suddenly called out to him again. She told him to go to the accounts office and collect 20 taels of silver as a reward. He bowed deeply, accepting the gift without hesitation. Seeing this, Lin Shua found him even more agreeable and spoke once more, noting that his skills shouldn't be wasted. She ordered him to move to the treasury, where several antiques needed repair, and even doubled his salary. He thanked her, his eyes brightening at the news. All of the Song family's rarest treasures were kept in that treasury. The next morning, he couldn't wait to head there, but as he passed the main gate, a problem arose. A deafening roar echoed in his ears. Despite his curiosity, he forced himself to keep walking toward the treasury without looking back. He knew that unnecessary curiosity only invites trouble, and in his position, it was better not to ask. However, the news reached him as soon as he arrived at the courtyard. An arena had been set up in the manor. It seems Song Lin Shua was about to engage in a duel. We learned that an hour earlier, a royal visitor had arrived. King Guangyun had brought his son, Zhao Qichong, to propose a marriage alliance. He thought he could pressure the Song family, but Lin Shua had responded with utter disdain. She declared that they should discuss marriage only after a fight. Her martial talent was well known, but the king never expected it to be quite this formidable. With only 2 moves, she easily defeated Zhao Qichong. The king couldn't help but remark that her martial arts mastery was already approaching the grandmaster realm. Song Tonghai shook his head modestly, though he couldn't hide the satisfaction in his eyes. He told the king that his daughter still required much more training. Since his second daughter had already joined an immortal sect, he had no intention of marrying off his eldest. He had never even considered the king's proposal. Just as it seemed the matter was settled, the king's tone suddenly shifted. He warned that many eyes were now fixed on the Song family's treasure. News of the Hualing sect's disciple returning home had already begun to spread across the surrounding kingdoms. And then, the king revealed something even more personal. He spoke a strange warning, noting that unless they had a hidden protector, the Song family lacked a true saint to guard them. Song Tonghai remained silent, appearing visibly shaken. King Guangyun smiled faintly, telling him to send word if trouble arose. After all, within the Great Zhou borders, few would dare move against the Zhao royal family. With those words, he departed the Song manor. Curiously, as soon as the king was gone, the panic on Song Tonghai's face vanished instantly. He returned to his study with a cold, stern expression. Seeing her father's dark mood, Song Lin Shua was confused and asked why anyone would dare move against them. Tonghai's expression only grew colder. He explained that the king's offer was a veiled threat, an attempt to force her into a marriage with his son. Lin Shua frowned, suggesting that if things were truly that dire, she could simply marry into the palace. To her surprise, Tonghai let out a cold snort of disdain. He asked if she truly thought the palace was a safe haven. If a real immortal sect decided to strike, King Guangyun wouldn't dare utter a single word of protest. Lin Shua looked down in shame, blaming herself for not being talented enough to enter a sect. Seeing her sadness, Tonghai's heart softened immediately. He declared that no daughter of his would ever be traded for safety. The Song family, he reminded her, has never produced a child who lives life on their knees. A murderous glint flashed in his eyes as he vowed to kill any intruder who crossed the line. Meanwhile, outside Luofeng City, Zhao Qichong hung his head in shame. He apologized for losing face, but the king dismissed it. To be honest, face doesn't put food on the table, and a real man doesn't fret over temporary setbacks. The king mused that the Song bloodline was truly extraordinary. In less than 300 years, they had produced 2 grandmasters and a potential immortal. His eyes narrowed as he assured his son that the girl would eventually be his. Such a bloodline would surely produce descendants with immortal bones. 11 days passed in the blink of an eye. On the surface, the Song manor seemed peaceful, but our protagonist, working in the treasury, sensed something was off. He noticed an unusual scent of change in the air. Lately, carriages had been frequently hauling heavy wooden crates out of the treasury to an unknown destination. Though he found it strange, he didn't dwell on it, focusing all his energy on the great Zhou Qi circulation manual. Finally, one day, the introductory chapter was restored. In the next moment, a massive flood of information rushed into his mind. As he had suspected, this manual did not require the wisdom of immortal bones. It was a path anyone could walk, where progress was tied to something far deeper than mere innate talent. He immediately went to the courtyard and sat cross-legged. He attempted to absorb the essence of the moonlight. Within moments, he felt a cool, refreshing energy enter through his crown and flow into his limbs. By the time he opened his eyes again, it was nearly noon. After 18 full cycles of circulation, he felt his internal strength had more than doubled. He felt a new current of energy flowing through his meridians. This was only the initial stage of Qi cultivation, the very first step of a much longer journey. To be a true Qi master, he would need to cultivate for at least 100 days. However, the time remaining for him was quickly running out. We move now to a side room, where Song Yun lay on a bed with his eyes tightly shut, his body wrapped in bandages. Song Linxue pushed the door open. She demanded to know what had happened and where her brother had been injured. Her father, Song Tonghai, replied grimly that he was hit by a hidden arrow at the city gates. The arrow had been fired from over 300 yards away. To pull a bow with such power, the attacker had to be a grandmaster. Linxue's eyes turned cold. She realized this was a warning. Luofeng City was clearly changing, and she suggested they should immediately recall their agents from across the city for safety. Surprisingly, Tonghai remained calm. He noted that the Song family wasn't yet worth the attention of the great sects. The attacker was likely just a hired hand. The goal was to pressure them into seeking help from the Lin family. At that moment, Tonghai made a firm decision, his gaze turning sharp and icy. He told Linxue she would leave the manor with him that very night. By the next morning, our protagonist headed to the streets to buy supplies for an emergency. But a strange thing happened. Even with silver in hand, he couldn't buy any food. The shopkeepers offered every excuse imaginable, but they simply wouldn't sell. He quickly sensed something was wrong. Someone was clearly targeting the Song family. He ducked into a tailor shop to change out of his servant's robes. Only then did he manage to buy food. When he returned to the manor, he found lunch was much smaller than usual, just 3 buns and a few side dishes. Just as he feared the family's situation was collapsing, shocking news arrived. Overnight, the city walls had been lined with severed heads for all to see. Most importantly, one of those heads belonged to a grandmaster. As the local power, Tonghai was the prime suspect, though no one dared to say it aloud. Even the local government remained silent. The impact of those heads was felt immediately. By evening, our protagonist's dinner had not only returned to normal, it was actually more lavish than ever, including 5 pounds of lamb chops and 2 pounds of beef. This meal eased his tension, if only for a moment. Still, he didn't dare slacken his training. Until he had enough power to protect himself, he knew that disaster could strike at any given moment. He also realized he needed a proper weapon. The following afternoon, he went to the armory and, after searching for a long time, finally chose 2 iron swords. These swords were heavy and powerful, perfectly suited for someone with his newfound strength. Since the treasury was being emptied, the security was quite lax. He successfully brought the iron swords back to his quarters. Over the next few days, he practiced Qi at dawn, repaired items by day, and waited for the night. He spent his nights practicing with the iron swords to grow accustomed to their weight. He thought life had finally settled into a calm rhythm, until one day, Song Linxue gave him a sudden warning. She told him to stay inside the manor for the next few days and not to go anywhere. Our protagonist nodded in agreement, sensing that Linxue wouldn't say such a thing without a very good reason. She had clearly received some troubling news, but he never imagined the change would come so much faster than expected. At midnight 4 days later, the peace was shattered. He was just about to begin his Qi cultivation when the sound of battle cries erupted nearby. He immediately gripped his iron sword, weighing his options between standing his ground or making a quick exit. Meanwhile, in a side room of the back courtyard, Song Yun snapped his eyes open. Hearing the shouts and the clashing of blades nearby, his expression shifted instantly to one of alarm. As he tried to force his energy to flow so he could stand up, a panicked Xiao Kai rushed in. She told him he couldn't move yet and insisted he go back to bed. The middle courtyard was already being defended by several guards and their men. Xiao Kai had been the one caring for Song Yun these past few days, and no one knew the severity of his injuries better. The slightest mistake could cause his internal meridians to collapse entirely. Despite the danger, Song Yun pushed Xiao Kai aside and began to dress, asking urgently about his sister's whereabouts. Xiao Kai pulled her hand back helplessly, explaining that the master was with the young lady, and besides, Linshua's martial arts were superior to his. He shouldn't worry so much, or so she thought. Song Yun hesitated for a moment, his eyes suddenly sharpening with a realization. He asked if anyone had gone to the treasury, though since it was empty, no one was there to guard it. Upon hearing Xiao Kai's words, Song Yun's face turned pale with dread. He grabbed his sword and strode out immediately. At that same moment, our protagonist was frowning at the treasury gates. Just as he was preparing to make a run for it, Song Yun's voice suddenly echoed from behind him. He told the young man to follow him, promising to protect him on the way out. He began heading toward the treasury gates, but our protagonist gave him a rather peculiar look. He asked if Song Yun was really there to save him, noting the man's ghostly pale complexion. Song Yun told him to stop talking and move, as he couldn't maintain his internal energy for long. He knew that if the boy died, his sister would be devastated. But just as he finished speaking, the treasury gates collapsed with a deafening crash. A figure holding a sword emerged slowly from the dust, the blade shimmering with a visible, flickering light. This sight made Song Yun turn even paler. This was manifested chi, the mark of a master with 1 foot already in the Grandmaster realm. Even at his peak, Song Yun would have struggled against him. With a desperate roar, Song Yun told the boy to run as he whirled around to face the threat. But to his utter shock, the space behind him was completely empty. The young man had already vanished. Song Yun stood there dazed for a second, but when he looked back toward the treasury gates, he saw a back that looked both familiar and strangely new. In the blink of an eye, our protagonist appeared directly in front of the man in black. A terrifying sense of pressure suddenly expanded outward, filling the air around them. The assassin was visibly stunned and instinctively tried to retreat. However, a piercing whistle of wind suddenly filled his ears as he hurriedly raised his sword to block the incoming strike. With a heavy clang, our protagonist's iron sword slammed into the assassin's blade. The chi protecting the weapon shattered instantly, but the truly terrifying part was yet to come. Under the sheer force of the impact, the iron sword bent 90 degrees and smashed directly into the man's body. Then, with a sickening sound of snapping bone, the man in black was sent flying, crashing through half of the courtyard wall. However, our hero didn't stop there. He stepped forward to give chase and once again swung his iron sword downward. In an instant, it was as if a rotten watermelon had exploded. Song Yun watched, completely dazed. He had killed him in just 2 hits. To take down a master of that caliber so easily was something even a grandmaster would struggle to do. Most bizarrely, he hadn't felt even a ripple of internal chi. Unable to contain his shock, Song Yun asked when he had become a grandmaster. Our protagonist simply replied that he was born with divine strength. To be honest, it was a bit of an understatement. Song Yun looked on in disbelief, but before he could speak, a sharp pain gripped his chest. His vision went dark, and he collapsed. Our protagonist rushed over to check on him. His pulse was scattered and weak, almost indistinguishable from the dead. But just as he thought Song Yun was beyond saving, the interface in his mind suddenly flickered to life. A message appeared, reparable. It noted a fatal sword wound on Song Yun's chest, exacerbated by the reckless use of his internal energy. The revelation left him stunned for a moment. Could he actually repair a human being? With no time to lose, he immediately used his daily repair charges. After 2 attempts, Song Yun's pulse began to stabilize. It worked. Although his body was still severely injured, the immediate danger to his life had passed. Whispering that the man was lucky to be alive, he tucked Song Yun safely under a bed. After making sure he was hidden, our protagonist hurried toward the front courtyard. As he crossed into the next area, he ran straight into 2 more men in black. Both sides froze for a heartbeat, but then, something rather strange happened. After sizing each other up, everyone seemed to relax. From our hero's perspective, these 2 had even less energy than the warrior he had just pulverized. Meanwhile, the 2 assassins saw a boy with heavy footsteps who clearly hadn't mastered chi yet. One of them mocked him, noting he had quite a handsome face. He sneered that it wouldn't be a waste to skin him and turn that face into a mask. Our protagonist didn't bother responding. Instead, he lunged forward. He swung the iron sword with a ferocious downward strike. The air let out a piercing whistle, revealing the power of an external martial arts master. The assassins' expressions shifted instantly. They tried to raise their blades to parry, just as the previous warrior had done. Naturally, the result was the same, and their defenses were utterly crushed. Having cleared the path, he didn't linger and instead reached the martial arts arena. The area was a scene of total chaos, with battles erupting in every corner. The most striking sight was the head of the house, Song Tonghai. He was being besieged by 3 masters at once, yet he showed no signs of falling. Nearby, the young lady Song Lingxue was also awake and fighting, surrounded by no fewer than 6 men in black. Just as she was about to be overwhelmed, Song Tonghai took a heavy palm strike from a master to protect her, suddenly turning to swing a blade of chi that instantly severed a black-clad man's arm. Although the pressure on Song Lingxue lessened, Song Tonghai began to lose ground. Curiously, our protagonist watched with his sword in hand, but didn't intervene yet. The battle was currently maintaining a fragile balance, and he knew that a reckless intrusion might actually do more harm than good. He scanned the martial arts arena, and a clever plan quickly formed in his mind. We see him quietly move toward an archery rack in the corner. Strangely enough, he only grabbed a quiver of arrows without taking a bow. Instead, he began snapping off the arrowheads one by one. He wasn't a trained archer, but he had been a prize-winning professional at throwing darts in his past life. He grabbed a handful of arrowheads and suddenly hurled 5 of them. The men besieging Song Lingxue collapsed the moment they heard the whistling air. The 3 masters reacted instantly, shouting for everyone to be careful. They immediately protected their bodies with internal chi while scanning the area, quickly spotting our hero in the corner. Yet, for some reason, he didn't look panicked. Instead, he grabbed a long spear beside him. His body leaned back sharply, and his muscles bulged with sudden, explosive power. A second later, the spear left his hand like a bolt of lightning streaking across the sky. The terrifying killing intent heading toward them made the three masters turn pale with shock. They tried to retreat, but Song Tonghai seized the opening, sweeping his sword chi-wide to disrupt their footwork. The spear caught up to one of the masters in an instant, easily shattering his protective chi and piercing through him. It pinned him firmly to the perimeter wall. Terrified, the remaining two masters fled toward the exit. To be honest, they weren't sticking around to find out what was next. As soon as their figures vanished, our hero suddenly collapsed to the ground. He had poured his entire spirit and focus into that single, devastating throw. Song Tonghai gave him a long, meaningful look but didn't approach, choosing instead to organize the cleanup. It was Song Lingxue who walked over, looking dazed. She asked if he was really the one who killed those men. He nodded in confirmation, his tone much calmer and less aggressive than it used to be. He was only 1/5 of the way through his 100-day chi training, yet he could already kill a master. Once he reached the spirit transformation stage, his power would be world-shaking. Song Lingxue couldn't help but grab his wrist to check his pulse. She was even more astonished to find that he truly possessed no internal chi whatsoever. When she asked where this strength came from, he simply explained that practicing the Dragon Tiger technique made him feel much stronger. It was a convenient excuse, at least. Song Lingxue's favor toward our hero only grew, as she not only provided him with resources, but even shared the Song family's Dragon Tiger technique. He decided to simply attribute his recent performance to that technique, since the concept of chi refining doesn't exist in this world. However, Song Lingxue's intuition told her that something was definitely off. Just as she was pondering what didn't fit, the sudden sound of galloping hooves echoed outside the house. Finally, at this late hour, the Luofeng city guards had arrived. "Master Song, forgive our late arrival. Where are the rebels?" asked General Luo, the man leading the troop. Despite his lower rank, he showed Song Tonghai no respect at all. One might expect Song Tonghai to be furious, but instead, he remained remarkably composed. He calmly replied that the rebels had already retreated and thanked General Luo for the midnight rescue. However, the general's next words immediately ignited the anger of the Song family martial artists. He requested that Master Song hand over the bodies of the attackers for a centralized burning to prevent disease. This was a blatant attempt to steal credit for the victory. Moreover, those bodies were evidence that could reveal who was behind the attack. The government's actions reeked of a cover-up. Yet strangely enough, Song Tonghai's expression remained flat as he told General Luo he would be troubled with the task. With their master's word given, the martial artists could only endure in silence as the guards swaggered into the Song estate to haul away the corpses. To our hero, General Luo's attitude confirmed his earlier suspicions. The Song family's current plight was being orchestrated by the local government. This realization gave him quite a headache, making a quick escape seem like his best option. But he wasn't the only one feeling the pressure. Back at the city office, General Luo reported that Song Tonghai appeared uninjured and Song Lingxue was unharmed. The city lord frowned upon hearing this. Seeming quite disappointed by the news, General Luo couldn't help but ask why the city lord was targeting the Song family after years of peaceful coexistence. The city lord, clearly annoyed, snapped at him to stop asking questions that didn't concern him and dismissed him. However, General Luo didn't move. He reminded the lord that the Song family's second daughter was part of a powerful sect. If they went too far, they might not be able to handle the consequences. He begged for any information the lord might have. Suddenly, a flicker of unease crossed the city lord's eyes as he whispered that King Wang Yun had his sights on the eldest Song daughter for a princess consort. This was a move to force the family into submission. The city lord had no idea, of course, that he had provoked a truly terrifying existence. The next morning, we find our hero lost in thought over breakfast. Just as he was debating his next move, Song Lingxue suddenly sat down beside him and asked if he was full. She asked if he wanted more, but he simply swallowed his bun and shook his head, thinking of the medicinal herbs and techniques Song Lingxue had provided. He couldn't help but sigh inwardly. He wasn't the type to flee and leave a debt of gratitude behind, yet if he took her with him, pursuers like those from last night would surely be endless. Speaking of last night, a sudden doubt flickered in his mind. He felt as though he had forgotten something. As he frowned in thought, a sudden noise echoed from the storage room. Seeing Song Yun limping out, he finally realized exactly what he had forgotten. For a moment, he felt quite ashamed. Song Yun had dragged his wounded body to save him, yet he had left the poor man under a bed all night. Just as he was about to apologize, shocking news arrived. The city lord and General Luo were dead. Their heads were hanging right in front of the city office. This news sparked immediate and massive panic, causing the public's trust in the Great Zhou government to practically collapse. In less than a day, families began fleeing the city in droves. Within 2 days, the news had traveled 10,000 miles to the Great Zhou Imperial Palace. Inside the Qingwan Hall, the emperor was in a towering rage. This was a blatant provocation of imperial authority. His ministers begged him to calm his anger, insisting that such rebels must be captured immediately. The emperor soon regained his composure and ordered 500 Zhuge guards to Luofeng City. They were to uncover the truth within half a month and bring the rebel leader to the capital. Additionally, King Wangyun was summoned to court immediately. At that moment, King Wangyun had no idea the emperor was thinking of him. He sat in his study, muttering that he had underestimated Song Tonghai. Beside him, Zhao Jichong was quite surprised, asking if his father meant that Song Tonghai was the one who killed Yuan Xingcai and Luo Wang. However, King Wangyun sighed, noting that it wasn't that simple. This matter might even disturb the immortal sects, but regardless of who did it, Song Tonghai was now in deep trouble. Seeing his son's confusion, the king prepared to explain, but a loud announcement of an imperial decree interrupted them. King Wangyun narrowed his eyes and told his son to prepare to accompany him to the capital, but in a surprising turn of events. As soon as the king arrived at the palace, the emperor slapped him hard across the face. He told the king he had been far too impatient. The emperor reminded him that the Song family's second daughter, Song Lingqing, was a talent of the highest order. The king looked up in shock, asking if it was true. Holding his face, he claimed he wouldn't let his own flesh and blood marry a woman carrying a family vendetta. Seeing that the king's reaction seemed genuine, the emperor finally nodded slightly. He warned him to keep his ambitions in check for now. The emperor warned him not to interfere with the Song family again, as there were many hidden secrets that could bring him trouble. This immediately piqued King Wangyun's curiosity. He wondered if his brother might explain further. The emperor took a breath and revealed a world-shaking secret. 3,000 years ago, there was a heavenly lord named Song. This figure had supposedly stepped through the gates of true immortality, and his ancestral home was less than 1,000,000 miles from the Greyjoy borders. To suggest the Song family might be descendants of a heavenly lord was staggering. Immortal sects were just people practicing, but a heavenly lord was a true immortal. However, the emperor shook his head, telling the king not to overthink it. He had his own plans for investigating the Song bloodline and told the king to stay out of it. With that, he turned and entered the hall. King Wangyun stood stunned for a moment before leaving the side hall in deep thought. Meanwhile, back in Luofeng City, with the city lord gone, countless citizens were fleeing. It seemed like the perfect time for our protagonist to leave, yet he chose to stay and rest instead. He calculated that he was only 70 days away from completing his 100-day qi refinement. He hoped to stall until the imperial court finished its investigation. During this time, Song Lingxue followed him everywhere, attending to his every need with meticulous care. He didn't mention leaving, and she didn't ask him to stay. There was a silent understanding between them, and he thought things would remain peaceful until the day Song Tonghai suddenly came to find him. This was their first real face-to-face conversation, but her father's first words left him completely stunned. He wanted to entrust Lingxue to him and have them flee together. He offered to stay behind to buy them time. Our hero quickly waved his hands, telling the family head there was no rush until the court finished the investigation. He thought they still had time, but Song Tonghai's next sentence absolutely terrified him. He simply asked, who did he think killed those two men? Looking at Song Tonghai's calm expression, the identity of the killer became painfully obvious. In an instant, he felt a massive headache coming on. Killing officials was an act of rebellion. Running away seemed like the best option again, but he quickly dismissed the idea. To be honest, it was too late for that. Leaving now would be seen as fleeing from guilt, triggering an imperial pursuit that might even involve the immortal sections. As he pondered how to stall for time, he suddenly realized a crucial point. He tentatively asked the family head if he knew the relationship between the Great Zhou's backing sect and the Second Lady's sect. To his surprise, Song Tonghai shook his head and revealed that the Great Zhou actually had no immortal sect behind it. Yes, you heard that correctly. However, the Zhao family did have members with immortal bodies within various major sections. Strangely, hearing this actually made him feel much more at ease. 7 days later, a troop of iron cavalry entered Luofeng City. Every martial artist in the city was forcibly taken away and brought to the city lord's manor. The Grand Commander, Li Mingzhou, scanned the crowd with a sharp gaze before shouting a question. Where was Song Tonghai when Yuan Xingcai and Luo Wang were killed? Song Tonghai answered truthfully, explaining that his home had just been raided that night, and, having been injured himself, he was busy tending to his wounds. Li Mingzhou sized him up for a moment before giving a heavy command. Take off your shirt. Song Tonghai obeyed, revealing a torso covered in various scars. Strangely enough, Li Mingzhou only glanced at them twice before waving his hand for him to leave. He didn't even bother questioning the rest of the Song household. The group was released almost immediately, leaving those who knew the truth utterly confused. After all, Luo Wang had stolen the body of the man in black that day. Song Tonghai certainly had the motive and the time to kill out of resentment, so we have to wonder, what exactly made Li Mingzhou let them go so easily? Just as everyone was scratching their heads, Li Mingzhou suddenly pointed directly at our protagonist and told him to stay. Soon, the hall was empty save for the two of them. However, the very first thing the commander said was an offer to take him as a disciple. It turns out Li Mingzhou had an incredibly sharp eye for talent. He saw that while the young man had no internal cultivation, he possessed a natural, godlike strength. To be honest, our hero found the situation quite awkward. Li Mingzhou was a grandmaster, but once our hero finished his 100-day qi refinement, he could likely defeat the man with a single hand. Still, this confirmed his theory. Since the royal Zhao family had immortals in every major sect, they remained neutral to avoid offending anyone. Li Mingzhou was likely just here for show. While our hero was lost in thought, Li Mingzhou suddenly struck the air with his palm. A stone wall 3 feet away collapsed with a deafening roar. He slowly withdrew his hand, claiming this was a unique technique he discovered that only he knew. He promised to teach it if the boy became his disciple. He had no idea, of course, that our hero's attention was entirely captured by his system panel. It displayed the Xiantian seal, a 5th-tier divine ability from a god. The technique had 9 forms in total, though repairing it would be incredibly difficult. To give you an idea, a 5th-tier skill is even stronger than a perfected dragon tiger body. It was only 1 tier lower than the great Zhou Qi technique itself. Ultimately, he politely declined, thanking the commander for the guidance, but stating he had his own path. With that, he slowly walked out of the city lord's manor. Obtaining the 3rd form of the Xiantian seal made the entire trip more than worth it. That night, as he sat reviewing the recent chaos, a terrifying realization suddenly dawned on him. The Imperial Court's neutral stance told him something vital. It meant the court had nothing to do with the night the Song family was attacked. If that was the case, then a hidden immortal sect had to be involved. He was just about to wipe the cold sweat from his forehead when a soft sound echoed from the roof. He snapped his head up, his eyes narrowing in the dark. There was someone on the roof, and more than one, as it turned out. Our hero immediately gripped his iron sword, carefully capturing every trace of movement. As his concentration deepened, a dozen flowing currents of chi appeared in his perception. For people were on the roof, while others guarded every side of the house. Among them, 5 had already reached the Grandmaster realm. Clearly, this ambush was meant specifically for him. With a sharp glint in his eyes, he suddenly moved. He leapt upward, swinging his iron sword with immense force against the roof's crossbeam. The 4-inch thick timber snapped instantly, and the entire roof began to collapse. Years of accumulated dust billowed up like a thick curtain, instantly obscuring the vision of those watching from all sides. The men on the roof instinctively jumped back, but they were surrounded by dust. Strangely enough, while everything was a blur to the naked eye, our hero chose this moment to close his eyes and sense his enemies. 7 days had passed since his last battle, and his strength had grown by another 1,000 pounds. As one Grandmaster searched through the dust for the bedroom, the sound of whistling air suddenly tore through the silence. In the next breath, the iron sword fell heavily, and the man was instantly reduced to a bloody mess. But the true terror was only beginning. Using his full strength, he hurled the iron sword toward 2 figures silhouetted in the air. To be honest, they never stood a chance. The 2 men were unable to dodge and were sent flying over 100 feet by the impact. By the time they hit the ground, their breath had already left them. In the blink of an eye, 3 of the 4 on the roof were dead. However, just as he tried to catch his breath, the remaining Grandmasters all struck at once. Violent gusts of wind swept over him, leaving bloody gashes across his body. Yet, in a bizarre display, the flesh at his wounds rippled and the bleeding stopped almost instantly. His dragon tiger body had reached a level of perfection where his physique was no longer human. He's a physical Grandmaster. Use hidden weapons, one of them shouted. The moment the words were out, countless projectiles flew toward him. He immediately smashed through a brick wall and ducked into the estate's weapon storehouse. A moment later, several long spears shot out like bolts of lightning. In an instant, 5 more attackers lost their lives as the chaos spread through the grounds. Old Kai and the young mistress, Song Miling, rushed toward the noise. However, both were still carrying injuries and quickly found themselves at a disadvantage. Hidden within the armory, our hero waited for an opening. With the 4 remaining Grandmasters now on high alert, his thrown spears could no longer land a killing blow. Just as the situation reached a stalemate, 2 streaks of light suddenly cut through the night sky. They slammed into 2 Grandmasters, vaporizing them on the spot. The Grand Commander, Li Mingzhou, had arrived. Faced with a true master of his caliber, these assassins had no hope of resisting. Within breaths, the last 2 were captured. Song Tonghai stepped forward, bowing in deep gratitude for the commander's timely intervention. However, Li Mingzhou didn't even spare him a glance. We see Song Tonghai step forward to unmask the 2 captured Grandmasters, but the moment he sees the first face, his brow furrows in shock. It was Yin Ping. He couldn't understand why Yin Ping was here. This was an old acquaintance from Beiyin County, a place over 80,000 miles away from the Song estate. The 2 of them had absolutely no reason to cross paths like this. Song Tonghai took a deep breath and asked why a man with no grudge against him was doing this. He pleaded for a name, but Yin Ping simply hung his head in silence. However, the other Grandmaster suddenly barked out that they were merely following orders. He told them to just get the killing over with, claiming the Song family wouldn't outlive him by much anyway. Before he could finish, Li Mingzhou's hand shot out. With a brutal flick of his fingers, he tore the man's tongue out by the root. He decided to take this one alive to present to the emperor as a report. Li Mingzhou then turned his cold gaze toward Yin Ping, reminding him that the emperor's wrath would surely lead to the execution of his entire 9 generations. If he spoke now, he might earn a quick death and spare his family from the fallout. Song Tonghai added his own voice, his tone carrying a hint of genuine plea. He reminded Yin Ping of their past friendship, hoping for an answer. Finally, Yin Ping let out a hollow laugh and revealed the truth behind the shadows. The order had come from the Yeguan Pavilion, an immortal sect. Their goal was to force the Song family to beg the Huanling sect for help to test their reaction. Yin Ping warned him to send out the distress signals immediately. By doing so, the Yeguan Pavilion would be satisfied, granting the Song family a few months of peace. But if the Huanling sect remained silent after that, the next attackers wouldn't be mere mortals of flesh and bone. Yin Ping then looked up at Li Mingzhou. He asked if the commander's promise of mercy for his family still stood. Li Mingzhou didn't say a word, but gave a slight, solemn nod of confirmation. After bowing in gratitude, Yin Ping ended his own life on the spot. Ultimately, Song Tonghai decided to follow the advice and began writing the letters for help. The next morning, dozens of messenger pigeons were released. If the Huanling sect didn't respond to this, they might as well start preparing for their own funerals. Meanwhile, the other Grandmaster was escorted out of the city. The citizens lined the streets, their faith in the great Zhou government slightly restored by the sight. As they reached the city gates, Li Mingzhou glanced back at Song Tonghai and sent a private message. If there was a next time, he would personally take his head. Song Tonghai's expression didn't flicker as he bowed deeply, wishing the commander a safe journey. With the imperial officials gone, Luofeng City returned to a quiet calm. Li Mingzhou's visit had made the government's stance clear. They would remain neutral. For the Song family, this was actually the best news they could hope for. Now, everything depended on how the Huanling sect would react. To be honest, however, Song Tonghai wasn't holding his breath for a miracle. We know the Huanling sect couldn't possibly be ignorant of the Song family's plight, yet their silence spoke volumes. To survive, they would have to save themselves. On the day after Li Mingzhou's departure, Song Tonghai came to find our protagonist with a plan to lead a transport convoy out of the city. He was met with a look of pure confusion. While the direct attacks on the Song estate had ceased, Luofeng City was undoubtedly under a secret blockade. However, Song Tonghai had clearly made up his mind. He proposed that he, the protagonist, and Ling Shui each lead a separate convoy through 3 different routes. If they escaped, they would reunite at the Great Zhou's southeast border. The risks of leaving the city were immense, but eventually, he nodded in agreement. It was a good chance to see exactly how many hostile forces were still hiding in the shadows. Waiting around for death was never a good strategy, after all. He quickly packed his bags, but just as he prepared to focus on his cultivation, footsteps echoed outside his courtyard. Song Ling Shui had arrived, bringing her younger brother, Song Yun, along with her. She looked troubled, as if she were about to ask for a difficult favor. She explained that too many people were targeting her, and with her limited strength, protecting him was becoming a struggle. With an apologetic tone, she asked if he would take the boy. Beside her, Song Yun remained silent. At this moment, he was indeed a burden, and to be honest, his past relationship with the protagonist hadn't exactly been friendly. They likely expected a rejection, but to their surprise, he agreed immediately. Whatever his reasons, Song Yun had risked his life to save him before, and that was enough. With a sigh of relief, Song Ling Shui thanked him and prepared to leave, but he called out to her. Tomorrow's journey would be dangerous, and she was still carrying a heavy burden. He noticed she was still injured. He invited her inside, suggesting he could help treat her wounds before they set out on their separate paths. Song Yun hesitated for a moment at the entrance, but ultimately, he chose not to follow them inside. He slowly reached out and pulled the door shut behind them. The boy turned and looked up at the sky, feeling the faint, phantom ache of an old arrow wound in his chest. Meanwhile, inside the room, the atmosphere was quite different. Our protagonist rolled up his sleeves and casually asked the young lady of the Song family to lie face down on the couch. It was a perfectly practical request, of course. Song Ling Shui glanced back at the closed door, hesitated for a brief second, and finally lay down. The bed was filled with a warm, familiar scent that made her start to relax. But the moment his palms pressed against her shoulders, her nerves tightened once again. Her heart began to race, fluttering with a sudden, uncontrollable panic. She had no idea, however, that his mind wasn't on her at all. He was focused entirely on the system interface appearing in his vision, scanning her condition. The panel indicated that Song Ling Shui had 4 distinct weapon injuries that could be repaired. He gave her shoulders a simple massage as he prepared to activate the skill. He tentatively triggered the repair function, and a sudden surge of warmth flooded into her body. Song Ling Shui's eyes snapped wide open in total shock. She could feel her internal injuries mending, causing the strange, distracting thoughts in her mind to vanish instantly. She couldn't help but ask how such a thing was possible. She wondered where he had learned such a miraculous method. He simply replied that it was a special massage technique, and to keep things from moving too quickly, he slowed his pace. After an hour of this, Ling Shui felt completely refreshed, and the pain from her wounds had vanished. He told the young lady she could get up now and try walking around. He pulled back his hands and turned to open the door, only to find young Song Yun sitting there with his head down, looking like a lonely statue covered in the evening dust. Our protagonist checked his interface, seeing 2 repair charges remaining, and beckoned the boy over. He told Song Yun to come inside. Early the next morning, the 3 groups were in front of the gates, checking the horses and carriages for the journey. During the preparations, Ling Shui suddenly approached him with a heavy bundle. He looked at her with confusion as he took the package, noting its significant weight. For some reason, Ling Shui didn't say much, only mentioning it contained some supplies. She claimed it was just food and travel money before hurrying away. An hour later, the three groups departed from the Song estate. He and Song Yun headed south at a gallop. He expected to be intercepted, but to his surprise, the journey was perfectly calm. It wasn't until 2 days later, hundreds of miles from Luofeng City, that they finally stopped. Only then did he find the time to open the bundle Ling Shui had given him. Inside, besides the expected food and silver, he found something far more valuable. She had given him a map to the Jews' kingdom, a land of chaos perfectly suited for someone with his strength to thrive. He casually tossed the accompanying letter to Song Yun. He rubbed his temples, realizing he now stood at a crossroads. There were two paths before him. He could either keep going or return to the city. After a moment of reflection, he seemed to make a decision. He pulled out his diary and brush, writing that being indecisive was not the mark of a true man. He had arrived in this world with nothing, and he could leave it just as easily. At worst, it would only cost him his life. But then, something strange happened. He looked at the word death and suddenly crossed it out. Returning to the Song family didn't have to be a dead end. Beside him, Song Yun finished reading the letter, his grip tightening. The boy opened his mouth to speak, but our protagonist cut him off. He would return alone, while Song Yun was to continue to choose to wait for his sister's eventual return. Song Yun took a deep breath and suddenly knelt, bowing his head to the ground. He begged the protagonist to bring his sister back safely, promising to repay this great debt. He told the boy he'd better focus on staying alive long enough to do so. With that, he mounted his horse and began the long ride back toward Luofeng City. What he didn't know, however, was that a massive conspiracy was waiting for him. Meanwhile, back at the Song estate, Song Tonghai and Ling Shui were waiting. We returned to the city, where the father and daughter sat opposite each other in silence. Unlike our protagonist, they had been intercepted less than 10 miles from the gates. Curiously, the men blocking their path didn't attack. They simply forced them back to the city. The two didn't resist, returning to the Song estate immediately. As the days passed without any sign of his return, they began to relax, assuming he had successfully escaped. But just as they were waiting for the situation to shift, a maid suddenly rushed in with a message. She announced that people claiming to be from the illusory spirit sect had arrived at the gates, asking for the master. Song Tonghai stood up abruptly, his face a mask of pure disbelief. Ling Shui was equally shocked. To be honest, they never expected that sect to actually help. In their minds, the idea of the illusory spirit sect reaching out was a distant dream. He hurriedly ordered the servants to prepare the main hall and serve the best tea. Song Tonghai didn't wait. He gathered his inner energy and leaped across the rooftops, reaching the front gate in a few bounds. Ling Shui followed just a step behind him. When they arrived at the entrance, they found only a single man standing there. This caused Song Tonghai to hesitate, cautiously asking if he was an immortal from the sect. The man didn't answer with words. Instead, he slowly raised his hand. A second later, a ball of fire ignited in midair, radiating a terrifying wave of heat. He introduced himself as Fu Quanliang, an outer disciple sent by the sect to assist the Song family. Song Tonghai quickly invited the immortal inside. Watching this display, Song Tonghai stepped forward with excitement, as if he had finally grasped a life-saving straw. The sect's presence alone changed everything. Their willingness to intervene meant the Song family could finally sleep soundly. Ling Shui felt the weight lift from her shoulders, and for a moment, she could breathe again. She was about to head back inside when a lone rider suddenly appeared at the end of the long street. She watched in a daze as he stopped right before the gate. She asked him why on earth he had come back, her eyes instinctively scanning the road behind him. He dismounted and walked past her, telling her not to bother looking. He explained that he was alone and that the others had already continued toward Juz. Ling Shui followed him, her voice urgent as she asked why he would return to this mess. She reminded him that this conflict had nothing to do with him. He simply replied that if he wanted to leave, he would do so on his own terms, without needing an escort. He noted that to cultivate the path, one must first cultivate the heart. On the ride back, he felt his internal energy flowing more smoothly than ever before. Ling Shui's pace lightened as she told him his timing was actually quite good. She mentioned that an immortal from the illusory spirit sect had just arrived to settle things. Our protagonist was surprised to hear they had actually sent someone, but that surprise was quickly replaced by suspicion. The Song family's crisis wasn't exactly new news. He wondered why they had waited until now to send a single person. Ling Shui, however, just smiled and nodded, mentioning the immortal's name was Fu Quanliang. His name was Fu Quanliang, an outer disciple of the illusory spirit sect, and he was already in the main hall. As we follow them, they arrive at the hall's entrance. After entering, our protagonist didn't speak. Instead, he stood to the side, quietly observing Fu Quanliang. His suspicion grew deeper with every passing second. In his perception, the intensity of the energy within Fu Quanliang was actually weaker than that of the Grandmaster, Li Mingzhou. As his doubts intensified, Song Tonghai suddenly spoke up nervously, asking the immortal if the sect had received his letter for help. Unexpectedly, upon hearing this, Fu Quanliang looked confused, admitting he hadn't heard of any letter. He explained he was simply there on a senior elder's request to guard the Song family for a while. Song Tonghai nodded repeatedly, relieved that the sect still cared for them. Fu Quanliang noted it was only natural, given that the young Miss Song possessed a high-grade spiritual root. He predicted she would surely become a great elder of the sect one day. Fu Quanliang waved his hand dismissively, his attitude surprisingly approachable and kind. He mentioned hearing the Song family had run into some trouble and asked for the details. He hoped to resolve it quickly so he could return to the mountain gate early. After speaking, he took a calm sip of tea, radiating a sense of immense confidence. It was as if the family's troubles could be wiped away with a flick of his finger. Song Tonghai looked a bit hesitant, explaining that even he wasn't entirely sure of the details. Their opponent was also a hidden immortal sect, and they only knew a name. Beyond that, they were completely in the dark regarding the inner workings of the conflict. He mentioned the name was the Yeguang Pavilion, a power from the north that the immortal had surely heard of. But strangely, upon hearing the name, Fu Quanliang suddenly turned pale and stood up abruptly. He demanded to know if Song Tonghai was absolutely certain it was the Yeguang Pavilion and that there was no mistake. Song Tonghai confirmed it was true, as he and his daughter had heard it personally. This panicked reaction terrified Song Tonghai, who nervously asked if there was a problem. However, Fu Quanliang's next words were even stranger. He claimed it was nothing, but insisted he needed a quiet room for a brief period of secluded cultivation. He ordered them not to disturb him unless it was urgent. Song Tonghai, feeling a deep sense of unease, hurried off to make the necessary arrangements. Watching this, our protagonist narrowed his eyes. Fu Quanliang's reaction seemed to confirm his earlier suspicions. The illusory spirit sect knew exactly who the Yeguang Pavilion was. Yet, Fu Quanliang had accepted the mission to guard the family without knowing what he was actually facing. Thinking of this, he suddenly realized something crucial. He had fallen into a major misconception. Perhaps he had overestimated the strength of the illusory spirit sect. That night, we see him being settled into a guest room. He immediately began to rest, knowing he had to grow stronger as quickly as possible to protect himself. He knew he needed the strength to withstand any risk. Fu Quanliang's strange reaction had already sparked many dark thoughts, and he realized that, in the end, he could only rely on himself. However, we see that Song Tonghai and Song Lingxue felt quite the opposite. Although Fu Quanliang's behavior was undeniably odd, they chose to see it in a different light. Since he hadn't simply walked away, they convinced themselves the situation wasn't that dire. After being on edge for so long, their spirits were beginning to fray. It is human nature to hope for the best as a way to escape reality. Our protagonist expected Fu Quanliang to stay hidden in seclusion, but surprisingly, he emerged the very next day. As soon as he stepped out, he began making all sorts of bizarre demands of Song Tonghai. He wanted exotic delicacies, beautiful concubines, and dancers. Naturally, Song Tonghai complied with every request, but since the family's savings had already been depleted, he was forced to take a desperate measure. He mortgaged the ancestral home to hire over a dozen dancers for Fu Quanliang's pleasure. Money flowed out like water while the immortal enjoyed his newfound luxuries. The courtyard became a den of indulgence, filled with music and singing every night. Our protagonist watched all of this, and though he understood the grim reality of the situation, he actually hoped Fu Quanliang would keep enjoying himself. With the end of his 100-day cultivation period drawing near, he needed the man to buy him as much time as possible. He believed everything was under control, until one day, Song Lingxue suddenly approached him carrying a small bundle. To be honest, she looked quite exhausted. She told him these were the last of the medicinal pills. He took the bundle, knowing his cultivation depended entirely on these spiritual herbs to progress. For some reason, after delivering the medicine, Lingxue didn't leave. Instead, she sat down in the courtyard. He didn't hide his actions from her, taking several golden essence pills at once. He immediately began absorbing the great sun essence. Only after he finished his session did she let out a long sigh, noting that Fu Quanliang's appetite was growing larger by the day. She remarked that he ate a whole suckling pig for breakfast and half a sheep for lunch, acting like a hungry ghost who knew his days were numbered. Our protagonist chose to remain silent. After all this time, even Lingxue had sensed something was wrong. With a dim look in her eyes, she asked why he had even bothered to return and help her family when there was no benefit. He replied that he was simply trying his best, but if it truly became impossible, he would flee, and he wouldn't be taking them with him. He didn't sugarcoat his words. He stated his thoughts directly, as he had no intention of doing something as foolish as dying for nothing. Surprisingly, hearing such blunt honesty seemed to lighten Lingxue's heart. A small smile appeared on her face as she said that was for the best, adding that it would be a bit of a pity if he were to die just like that. As he walked back toward his room, he asked her how many of the items he had requested she had managed to find. To increase his level as a restorer, he needed valuable materials. He required ancient and precious broken bones. The more significant the relic, the more experience he would gain from fixing it. She told him she had placed them all inside for him. We see that the items she gathered were mostly ancient relics of little monetary value. Curiously, after explaining this, Song Lingxue followed him right into his room and naturally sat down on the edge of the bed. He frowned, asking if she needed something, but she claimed her muscles were sore from overwork. With her cheeks flushing a faint red, Lingxue looked down and asked if he could use that massage technique on her again. Hearing this, he stepped forward. He placed his hand on her shoulder to check her condition, but his internal interface provided no notification of injury. He told her she was perfectly fine, but then, before he could finish his sentence, Ling Xue suddenly reached up and pressed her hand against his, preventing him from pulling away. She whispered that she still felt quite unwell. After a long, heavy silence, he finally pulled his hand back and firmly told her no. As soon as the words left his mouth, Ling Xue bolted upright and hurried toward the door. Just before leaving, she turned back to ask what kind of person he thought she was. He paused for a moment. Offering a somewhat vague evaluation, he called her a smart person. She simply replied that she felt she was quite wicked sometimes before pulling the door open. She walked out quickly, and it wasn't until she cleared the courtyard gate that she slowed down. Covering her face with her hands, she let out a low, shameful whisper about her own behavior. Meanwhile, our protagonist stared at the open door in silence for a long time before finally going out to draw 2 buckets of cold well water to douse himself. He wasn't blind to Ling Xue's hints, of course, but he didn't dare cross that particular red line, because, once crossed, walking away would no longer be a simple matter, and he wasn't sure he could carry the weight of the Song family's crisis. Shaking off these thoughts, he changed his clothes and headed to the storehouse. He buried himself in work, repairing the various scraps Ling Xue had scavenged. Soon, a month had passed. Fu Chuanliang's lifestyle grew even more extravagant and debauched by the day. The money for mortgaging the ancestral home was nearly gone, leaving Song Tonghai with no choice but to bow his head and borrow from the merchant guilds. He was barely holding things together, and the pressure was mounting. But what else could he do? Finally, our protagonist broke through to become a rank 1 restorer. Looking at the interface in his mind, his eyes glowed with golden light as he picked up a broken jade bowl. With a single thought, the bowl became whole again, yet his daily repair count remained at 5. The changes from this advancement were far greater than he had imagined. Although his daily limit hadn't changed, he could now repair any mundane item without consuming any of his charges. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. As he stared at the jade bowl, it suddenly transformed into solid gold. This cost him only a small amount of his internal energy. This was his newly realized divine ability, the Midas touch. Shortly after, he stood up and left the storehouse, but he had barely walked. Not long after, he happened to run right into Song Ling Xue. "You've come at the perfect time, follow me," he said casually, heading straight toward Fu Chuanliang's courtyard. Ling Xue followed him for a while, feeling quite confused, and asked what he was planning. He only offered a mysterious smile, telling her to just watch and see. At this point, he was less than 10 days away from completing his 100-day Qi training. A single strike now carried 10,000 pounds of force. To him, Fu Quanliang was no longer a threat. There was one vital matter he needed to confirm immediately. A moment later, we see them step into the main hall, which was in a state of absolute, drunken chaos. Wine jars and cups were scattered everywhere, looking like the remains of a truly desperate party. Fu Quanliang looked up and waved, calling out that Miss Song had finally arrived. He invited her to sit and share a few drinks, but Ling Xue simply pursed her lips and looked out the window, refusing to answer. Our protagonist glanced at the nearby dancers. He told the women to leave first. As they stood up to exit, Fu Quanliang immediately frowned at him, demanding to know who he was to dare interrupt his fun. The man called him insolent, but before the words could even settle, our protagonist kicked the table aside and lunged forward with startling speed. He gripped Fu Chuanliang's throat in a death vice, asking him a very simple question. Did he want to live or die? Fu's face turned pale instantly as he gasped that he wanted to live. Releasing his grip, our protagonist warned him that if there was a single lie in his answers, he would be sent to his grave. Once free from the restraint, Fu Quanliang hesitated. A spiritual light flickered at Fu's fingertips as he instinctively tried to counterattack, but sensing the overwhelming power radiating from the young man, he immediately lost his nerve. Rubbing his sore neck, he told him to go ahead and ask. Our protagonist went straight to the point. Why exactly did the illusion spirit sect send him here? The answer Fu Quanliang gave caused his expression to shift violently. We then see a sharp slap land on Jiang Tsuanhu's face, followed by several more to wake him up. Jiang Tsuanhu, who had been on the verge of death, slowly regained a flicker of consciousness and opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was a face stained with blood. Fu Quanliang grinned, slowly raising an iron sword with a smile that looked, to be perfectly honest, quite hideous. He told his victim to remember who was killing him today. With a heavy thud, the iron sword smashed down, only to be raised and brought down again. It was a brutal, relentless display of violence that didn't stop for a long time. He continued until Jiang Tsuanhu's upper body was nothing more than a bloody mess. Only then did Fu Quanliang finally stop, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. The pressure he had been suppressing for so long finally evaporated. Feeling suddenly drained of strength, he slumped to the ground and stared blankly into space. Watching this scene, Chu Zheng noticed the flying sword at his feet had stopped moving and picked it up. This weapon, known as the wind-treading sword, was a rare find. Among common weapons, it was considered a top-tier piece. Though it had seen decades of slaughter, it had been meticulously maintained by its owner and showed no signs of wear. The sword was flawless, capable of boosting a practitioner's spiritual power by 30%. After a brief moment of reflection, Chu Zheng made a decision. Ancient Qi training methods offered ways to bypass restrictions, meaning he could use this flying sword himself, though he didn't feel entirely comfortable doing so. Nearby, Fu Quanliang finally snapped out of his daze. He looked at Chu Zheng with genuine surprise, asking what method he had used to vanish earlier. He had heard of secret treasures that could hide one's form, but he had never actually seen it done. Do you want to learn the invisibility art? Chu Zheng asked casually. Fu Quanliang's eyes flickered with a sudden, desperate hope as he admitted that he did. Are you really willing to teach me? He asked. Of course not, Chu Zheng replied with a shake of his head. But I do have something else to give you. Fu Quanliang froze, wondering what it could be. The resonance seal. Chu Zheng opened his palm, manifesting his essence into a glowing rune before striking it directly into Fu Quanliang's forehead from a distance. From this moment on, if I live, you live. If I die, you die. Fu Quanliang's face turned pale as he stammered. And what if I die first? Then I'll burn plenty of spirit money for you, Chu Zheng replied calmly, to ensure you still live a good life in the underworld. Since entering the spirit palace, Chu Zheng had only managed to master 2 techniques. One was the invisibility art, and the other was this resonance seal. While the first was for survival, the resonance seal was a technique he had cultivated specifically for Fu Quanliang. The seal had heavy restrictions. It could only be used on a single target. Until the seal was removed or the person carrying it died, it couldn't be placed on anyone else. In ancient times, Qi trainers used this to tame powerful spirit beasts as lifelong companions. To be honest, it was a method born from the desire to have something reliable at one's back. It was a bond meant to ensure that, on the long road of cultivation, a practitioner was never truly alone or unprotected. In reality, the resonance seal's utility went much further. Once the mark was set, Chu Zheng could faintly sense every shift in Fu Quanliang's emotions and intentions. Fu Quanliang stood stunned for a moment before suddenly bolting upright. He looked at Chu Zheng's cold, indifferent expression and felt a chill run down his spine. His face flushed with a mix of fear and frustration. After a brief internal struggle, he slumped back down, defeated. What do you want from me by placing such a restriction? How could someone like me possibly help you? Chu Zheng pondered this for a moment, then casually tossed the wind-treading sword at Fu Quanliang's feet. We'll talk about that if you manage to stay alive, he said slowly. Fu Quanliang looked at the flying sword in confusion. What do you mean? You killed the owner. This sword should be yours. Ignoring him, Chu Zheng walked over to Jiang Tsuanhu's corpse and knelt down. After searching the body, he quickly pulled a palm-sized pouch from behind the man's waist. The opening was tied shut so tightly that no amount of physical strength could pull it open. What is this? Chu Zheng asked, making no effort to hide his ignorance as he handed it to Fu Quanliang. It's a storage bag. It requires spiritual power to open, Fu Quanliang explained. I can't use it, Chu Zheng noted, as he currently lacked the specific energy required. Fu Quanliang shook his head, noting that all of Jiang Tsuanhu's belongings should be inside. Chu Zheng felt a spark of curiosity and gently sent his internal essence into the bag. As he probed the storage bag, a small space about half a meter wide appeared in his mind. Inside, he saw various items scattered about in a messy pile. After a quick mental inventory, Chu Zheng reached in and pulled out a piece of jade about the length of a finger. Before he could even ask, his companion spoke up. Fu Quanliang took the initiative to explain that such jade can accelerate one's cultivation. In the world of practitioners, it serves as the primary currency, much like gold or silver. Chu Zheng wondered how much this single piece could buy and if it could be exchanged for common currency. He was trying to gauge the actual purchasing power of these spirit stones. If exchanged for worldly gold, a single piece could buy the entire Song family estate. However, as Fu Quanliang noted, no sane person would ever trade such a treasure for common metal. Fu Quanliang shook his head, explaining that value depends on the location. In sacred lands, low-grade spirit stones are so common they are considered a rather embarrassing gift. In small, dilapidated sects without spiritual veins, they might fetch something decent, but usually, they are simply consumed for cultivation. To be honest, they are the fuel of their world. Feeling a bit disappointed, Chu Zheng pulled out the remaining unfamiliar items one by one. He had Fu Quanliang identify each one, treating the man like a living encyclopedia. After a while, he finally tucked the bag away with a satisfied nod. He began using his own essence to slowly refine it, officially claiming the spoils of his victory over Jiang Tsuanhu. The total haul wasn't massive, the wind-treading sword being the only true prize, but it served its purpose. It had finally pushed open the door to the cultivation world for him. It offered a glimpse of the wonders ahead, and for now, that was enough. It wasn't until dusk that Song Tonghai and Song Lingxue finally dared to enter the courtyard. They immediately began arranging for a cleanup crew. The moment Jiang Tsuanhu had arrived, they had received a telepathic message from Chu Zheng telling them to hide, and they had only just emerged. Inside the house, the few maidservants were completely overwhelmed. They huddled together in a corner, trembling with fear, having no idea what had actually transpired outside. After Song Lingxue sent the girls away, Chu Zheng had her move Fu Quanliang's quarters. He was relocated to the very edge of the Song estate, far away from Chu Zheng's own room. With Jiang Xuanhu dead, the next reaction from the Yeguang Pavilion would be critical. Whether Fu Quanliang could actually function as a convincing shield remained to be seen. Time slipped away like sand through fingers, and soon, another half-month had passed. During these 2 weeks, the Song estate remained perfectly peaceful, without a single disturbance. The silence was so absolute that it felt almost eerie. This unnatural calm began to make even someone as composed as Chu Zheng feel a lingering sense of unease. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, we find Chu Zheng sitting cross-legged in the courtyard. He was focused on circulating his breath through his meridians. He spent his time absorbing the essence of the sun and moon to bolster his power. Unlike his initial rapid progress, he found that his strength was now advancing at a much slower pace. The surrounding yin and yang energies had gradually become thin for him, and while he could still cultivate, the speed was undoubtedly being severely restricted. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from outside the courtyard, and Chu Zheng slowly finished his exercise to see Fu Quanliang hurrying toward him. Sensing something was wrong, he asked what had happened, as Fu Quanliang had been told not to approach without a vital reason. The man replied that he had just received a message. The sect had ordered him to return immediately, stating that the Song family's affairs were no longer his concern. As he spoke, Fu Quanliang's expression became increasingly strange. A junior brother within the sect had also sent him a secret letter, revealing that senior sister Song had been ambushed, and her protector, Elder Qin, was gravely wounded and near death, having barely escaped back to the sect. Chu Zheng narrowed his eyes and asked for confirmation if Song Lingqing was dead. The letter hadn't explicitly mentioned her fate, but before Fu Quanliang could even finish his sentence, Chu Zheng had already done the math. If even Qin Feng was severely injured, what hope did Song Lingqing have? Given that the Huanling sect was recalling Fu Quanliang and abandoning the Song family, the conclusion was obvious. She was almost certainly dead. Just then, a crisp sound came from the courtyard gate. Song Lingxue stood there, her face pale and her expression completely blank. At her feet lay scattered wet lotuses. Chu Zheng's gaze shifted, and a slight smile played on his lips, until he could no longer suppress a low, dark chuckle. This deadlock, it seemed, had finally been broken. He shook his head, noting that with Song Lingqing dead, the family no longer held any value in the eyes of the immortals. For the Huanling sect, they were now irrelevant. The same applied to the Yeguang Pavilion. Jiang Xuanhu's death would naturally be blamed on the Huanling sect, and no one would ever think to link the incident to the Song family. Even if there was some lingering resentment, the family now had the chance to flee without being hunted by a sect. At the very least, they had a hope of survival. Song Lingxue didn't stay to hear more. She turned and ran to find Song Tonghai, while Chu Zheng slowly let his smile fade and turned his gaze toward Fu Quanliang. As for revenge, the thought hadn't even crossed his mind yet. How could someone with a low-grade immortal bone retaliate against a massive sect? To be honest, a person needs to have some ambition in this life. Chu Zheng stood up slowly, looking out toward the distant horizon. He raised his hand and closed it into a fist, as if he were grasping the very sun within his palm. He had come into this world to do great things. With the Song family matter settled, he told Fu to lead him into the sect, and in exchange, he would help him destroy it. What others couldn't do, he would. In Chu Zheng's eyes, whether it was the Huanling sect or the Yeguang Pavilion, they were all cut from the same cloth. To these immortal sects, mortals were merely shadows, but he was a man, a mortal, not an immortal. Song Lingqing's death and the sect's reaction taught him much. He realized that the Yeguang Pavilion hadn't moved against the Song family because their true target was never the family itself. They were playing a much deeper game. Their goal was to cut down Song Lingqing, the rising dragon. Now that the dragon had drowned before even leaving the abyss, there was no longer any need to bother with the family. Whether Jiang Xuanhu or Fu Quanliang lived or died at this point simply didn't matter anymore. To be honest, they had become entirely irrelevant to the sect's grand designs. While Chu Zheng was lost in thought, Fu Quanliang stood there dazed. The words "destroy the Huanling sect" were still echoing in his mind like a fever dream. He imagined himself smashing the head of the mission elder, just as had happened today. Chu Zheng called his name twice, but the man didn't react at all. Finally, Chu Zheng reached out and patted Fu Quanliang's face, telling him to wake up. Fu snapped out of his violent fantasies and looked at the young man before him. As he calmed down, reality set in. Chu Zheng still relied on sneak attacks to kill those in the spirit realm. How could he possibly hope to face an entire sect? Fu feared that following him would only lead to a shared grave. He was beginning to realize that Chu Zheng's logic was, shall we say, a bit different from a normal person's. Chu Zheng's primary concern, however, was practical. He needed a way to enter the Huanling sect. He asked if there was any method for him to get inside. Fu Quanliang hesitated, noting that he hadn't felt any magical fluctuations when Chu Zheng fought. He asked if the young man even possessed an immortal bone. Chu Zheng shook his head immediately. If he had an immortal bone, he would have chosen a different path long ago. Without one, becoming a true disciple was impossible. Fu Quanliang considered this for a moment. He suggested that if Chu Zheng could hide his internal power and pass the entry inspection, there might be another way. If he displayed the combat power of a mortal grandmaster, he could enter the Huanling sect as a laborer. After all, a chi refining cultivator's strength was roughly comparable to a grandmaster's. In fact, a mortal grandmaster was sometimes even more capable. Most sects welcomed such laborers because they didn't require any expensive cultivation resources to maintain. A few ordinary pills and basic food were enough to keep them working. Some grandmasters who focused on tempering their physical bodies were quite useful indeed. They could perform tasks that even the chi-refining disciples couldn't manage, making it a very profitable arrangement for the sect. But a laborer was still just a laborer. Their status was worlds apart from even the lowest outer disciple. Without a protector, they were destined to be burdened with the most grueling and filthy tasks imaginable. In the mortal world, a grandmaster would be a revered national treasure living in luxury. Choosing to be a sect's servant was, by any objective measure, a complete absurdity. Very few grandmasters would ever choose to endure such a life, so these specialized laborers are rare, even fewer in number than the outer disciples. As for training grandmasters themselves, the sects simply don't bother. It is, quite frankly, a waste of energy, as martial arts require their own rare talent. Furthermore, it tends to cause friction. Most young outer disciples possess a level of strength somewhere between the Yangli and Lingquan realms. Since those in the Yangli stage are the majority, they aren't necessarily a match for a grandmaster in a real fight. If there were too many grandmasters, the massive gap in status despite equal power would inevitably lead to conflict. And since immortal sprouts are so hard to find, any large-scale bloodshed would be a heavy loss for the sect. Even a low-grade immortal bone is considered far more valuable than 10 grandmasters combined. It simply wasn't worth the risk. Chu Zheng then asked what the entry inspection involved, as hiding his true strength wasn't a difficult task for him. Briefly merging the essence in his dantian into his physical body was easy enough. His only real concern was the specific nature of the pre-entry check. Fu explained they check for immortal bones and cultivation level. The sect is protected by a spirit array, meaning none of your personal belongings can be brought inside. Once you pass the array's inspection, you're given standard laborer clothing. Chu Zheng was a bit puzzled, asking if every entry and exit was handled this way. It seemed excessively strict. Fu Quanliang shook his head, explaining that this was only for laborers. For disciples, there was a far more complex process. The paths of immortality are full of strange tricks, and every time a disciple moves, it's a potential risk. Every time they return to the sect, an elder personally verifies their identity to prevent soul possession, shapeshifting, or demons hiding within secret treasures to sneak inside. Throughout history, countless sects have fallen to internal strife. Those with long legacies usually have defensive measures left behind by their ancestors. However, many of those defenses only stop external enemies, not internal traitors. Thinking of this, Fu Quanliang felt a sudden spark of excitement. If he could actually smuggle Chu Zheng into the Huanling sect, it would be like planting a hidden landmine right in their foundation. Perhaps, one day, he really could blow the Huanling sect to the heavens. Chu Zheng weighed his options for a moment and made his decision. They would leave tomorrow. Since he had the information he needed, there was no reason to delay. Meanwhile, Song Lingxue had been watching from the shadows the entire time. Upon learning that Chu Zheng intended to leave the next day, she personally dismissed everyone in the manor. In an instant, the great Song estate felt empty. Only a few people remained in the cold, quiet halls. That afternoon, Chu Zheng headed out alone into the streets of Luofeng City. As he walked around, we see that many martial artists were still lurking in the shadows. Their information networks weren't nearly as fast as Fu Quanliang's. They had no idea the situation had already shifted. Chu Zheng tried to communicate with them, but the process, to be honest, wasn't very pleasant. In the end, Chu Zheng returned with several corpses, both men and women. That night, he sat on his bed, packing his things for the journey ahead. He dug up the immortal sect manuals he had buried underground and tucked them into his storage bag, though he still needed a plan to get that bag past the gates. Suddenly, the door was pushed open. Song Lingxue stepped inside with a calm expression, asking where he intended to go when he set out tomorrow. Chu Zheng didn't hide his intentions, telling her truthfully, the Huanling sect. Having killed Jiang Tsuanhu, he felt his debt to the Song family was paid. Naturally, his next step was to pursue his own goals. Besides, the Song family's current situation was no longer as dire as it had been before. Upon hearing his destination, Song Lingxue seemed a bit surprised, asking him why on earth he would want to go to the Huanling sect. He replied that it was for revenge, but to avoid any misunderstanding, he quickly added that this had nothing to do with the Song family. He informed her that he had cleared out all the checkpoints near Luofeng City, so they could leave directly tomorrow. Helping Fu Quanliang was just a side task. He chose the Huanling sect simply because they appeared much weaker than the Yeguan Pavilion. Among the nearby sects, they looked like the easiest target. Even an old lady knows to pick the softest fruit, and with Fu Quanliang acting as an inside man, it was a logical choice, which, naturally, made perfect sense. Song Lingxue only believed the part about revenge. Since Chu Zheng had no personal grudge against that sect, she assumed he was doing this for Song Lingqing. With that thought in mind, she slowly walked forward to the edge of the bed. She reached out and pushed Chu Zheng back onto the mattress. Before he could even get a word out, Song Lingxue had already climbed onto the bed and was sitting across his waist. She looked down at him, casually pulling off her hair tie, so her long black hair cascaded down like a waterfall, partially veiling her eyes. Chu Zheng glanced at the moonlight outside and hesitated, suggesting they wait until tomorrow, as he preferred the day. Absorbing moonlight at night increased the yin energy in his body, which might affect his combat strength. Song Lingxue didn't say another word. She simply leaned down and bit his neck. Before dawn the next morning, a carriage slowly rolled out from the Song Manor's backyard. Song Lingxue was dressed in clean blue and white travel clothes. Wearing a bamboo hat, she urged the horse forward. Inside the carriage, Song Tonghai sat with his head bowed, his white hair messy and his eyes dull. His eyes, once full of life, were now a cloudy mess as he muttered to himself, "Qing'er my Qing." In his arms, he clutched several ancestral tablets. One of those tablets was brand new and perfectly clean. The next morning, when Chu Zheng woke up, the side of the pillow beside him was already empty. The Song Manor felt hollow, without a soul in sight. On the main hall table, he found a letter left by Song Lingxue, its contents brief and direct. She hoped Chu Zheng would give up on the Huanling sect and find a place to live well. She considered their debts settled and didn't want him wasting time. He shouldn't waste his life on meaningless things, she wrote. Chu Zheng remained expressionless as a spark from his hand turned the letter to ash. Settling all debts is easier said than done. To him, what she owed him was far from paid. Thinking back to last night, Chu Zheng couldn't help but sigh. He was, after all, still in the body of a 17-year-old, full of vigor and perhaps lacking a bit of restraint. Having indulged so early, he knew it would take extra effort to maintain his internal balance of yin and yang later on. Not that he regretted it, of course. Fu Quanliang entered the hall with his sword on his back and asked if it was time to leave. "Let's go," Chu Zheng replied, walking toward the gates. He raised a hand, and energy surged from his palm toward the sky, transforming in an instant into a mass of roaring, brilliant flames. As the two of them stepped out of the main gates, the fireball above shattered into a rain of fire that covered the entire Song Manor in seconds. At his level of cultivation, such minor spells were effortless. To avoid leaving tracks for any potential pursuers, he chose a clean break. Burning everything down was the safest way. Even the corpses he had brought back yesterday were now serving a purpose in this final act. They would help create the illusion that the entire family had been wiped out. Fire snakes leaped high, slowly consuming the gold-leafed family plaque. Watching the century-old estate vanish into the flames, Chu Zheng felt a slight twitch in his brow. He never imagined he would do this. To think he would personally destroy such a place just to hide what had happened here. As a former professional restorer of cultural relics, he was now the one burying a piece of history. Though to the rest of the world, this particular history was entirely insignificant. "Let's move," Chu Zheng said, turning away. He asked how far it was to the Huanling sect. "Not far," Fu Quanliang replied. "There's a branch nearby." Once they reached the branch, they could take a flying boat to the main sect. Fu Quanliang mentioned that a senior sister had brought him here in 2 days. But for the two of them on foot, it would take about half a month. Chu Zheng asked if that sister was pretty. "Of course," came the reply as the fire roared. Under the glow of the inferno, the two figures gradually vanished into the streets without a trace, as the fire raged on for a full day and night. And so, Weiyang County lost another of its century-old families. Several days later, over 100 armored cavalrymen arrived in a rush, stopping before the ruins. They were a step too late. Looking at the broken walls and charred remains, Zhao Yunheng, draped in his heavy robes, let out a long, weary sigh. Upon hearing that Song Lingqing had been targeted, he had rushed back from the capital, hoping he might finally obtain what he had long desired. He hadn't expected that despite his haste, he would still be too late. Beside him, Zhao Jichang shook his head, suggesting this might not be a bad thing. The Song family, it seemed, simply couldn't handle such a massive shift in fortune. Better not to touch such messy affairs, he thought, prompting a laugh from Yunheng. Yunheng teased the boy for having married 4 noble women in the capital, enjoying his wedding nights too much to care for Song Lingxue. But was this truly the Song Manor? Before Yunheng could finish his sentence, a voice suddenly drifted from the side. Without anyone noticing, a figure had appeared among the ruins. Dressed in green robes and appearing to be in his 20s, the stranger's clothes shimmered. A single drop of blood-red cinnabar between his brows added a touch of the supernatural. This mark gave his elegant face an almost demonic air. Yunheng frowned, asking who he was, but the man simply repeated his question. Was this the Song Manor? The stranger's brow furrowed slightly as he asked again, his patience clearly wearing thin. Such insolence caused the soldiers to draw their blades in an instant. This disrespectful attitude immediately enraged the 100 cavalrymen behind Yunheng. Then, a muffled, heavy sound echoed through the air. In a heartbeat, every soldier who had drawn a blade was torn apart, flesh from bone, turning into pools of blood along with their horses. Suddenly, only the Zhao father and son remained standing. Jichang trembled violently, his face turning deathly pale as he found himself completely speechless. Yunheng quickly confirmed it was indeed the Song Manor, blaming himself for his subordinates' lack of discipline and begging the immortal not to take offense. With a solemn expression, Yunheng dismounted and subtly shielded Jichang behind him, bowing deeply in apology to the powerful figure before them. He pleaded for their lives, hoping the immortal would show mercy for the sake of the Zhao family's ancestors. The man narrowed his eyes at the mention of the name. He asked where Zhao Tingxian was now, his voice growing louder and more piercing with every repetition of the name, shaking the very air around them. The sound rippled through the void like waves. Before the echoes could fade, rolling thunderclouds suddenly gathered in the heavens above. The clouds condensed into a pair of giant, emotionless eyes made of lightning. Deep within those pupils lay a chaotic swirl of primal yin and yang energy. The moment those churning thunderclouds appeared, the green-robed man's face turned deathly pale. Before he could even speak, a massive bolt of lightning descended like a giant sword from the heavens, striking him down with divine force. Nearby, Zhao Yunheng felt nothing more than a gentle breeze brush past his face. When he opened his eyes again, every trace of the Song family estate had vanished, replaced by a bottomless abyss. And so, the Song family was truly gone. News of the massacre spread like wildfire, and within days, it had reached every corner of the Great Zhou, becoming the favorite topic of gossip in every tavern. However, the shifts within the cultivation world of the neighboring kingdoms were far more violent than those of the mortal realm. We see this in the story of Fu Quanliang. The fact that he had managed to kill Jiang Tsuanhu, a feat of slaying someone far above his own rank, caused quite a stir among the low-level disciples of the local sects. For a mere mortal-strength disciple to kill a spiritual beast is something only a rare few outliers can achieve. Fu Quanliang, an obscure outer disciple, had performed a miracle. But what truly shocked the surrounding sects was the revelation that Zhao Tingxian was still alive. His cultivation had reached such a profound level that even speaking his name would allow him to track the speaker. He had even struck down an elder of the Yeguang Pavilion from across the void. To be honest, that is a terrifying level of power. Some powerful masters even suspected that Zhao Tingxian had already stepped through the immortal gate. Compared to such a legend, the existence of Fu Quanliang was hardly worth noticing. This news only circulated within the small circles of the sect elites. Meanwhile, throughout the Great Zhou, the immortal sects became much more cautious. Some even went as far as to close their branch offices within the Great Zhou and withdraw their resident disciples entirely. It was a time of quiet retreat for many. We move now to the Huanling Mountains in the kingdom of Tianxian, home to the Huanling sect. They have thrived here for over 10,000 years. In a radius of hundreds of thousands of miles, only 2 or 3 other sects can truly stand as their equals. The mountain range stretches for over 13,000 miles. Beneath it lies a high-grade spirit vein, providing the spiritual energy for tens of thousands of cultivators. Every month, the energy they breathe out creates a sea of glowing mist. At the foot of the mountains lies Huanling City, a massive metropolis spanning nearly 100 miles. This place serves as the gateway to the mountains. It is also the bridge between the immortal and the mortal. You see, even if one is born with immortal bones, their descendants are not guaranteed to inherit that talent. Many are born with ordinary mortal bodies, yet their status is different from commoners. Since the blood of cultivators flows in their veins, they cannot simply return to the mortal world. They would be outcasts among commoners, yet they lack the talent to walk the path of immortality. Thus, they are destined to live within the walls of this city. Compared to ordinary people, their children have a much higher chance of producing a spirit seedling. Over time, they naturally became the foundation of the immortal world. This city serves as the primary source of fresh blood for the sect, a place where dragons and snakes mingle and cultivators walk alongside commoners. Among the crowds are massive numbers of martial artists. Not all the cultivators here belong to the Huanling sect. Many come from smaller sects. They come to do business, trading for resources that are nearly impossible to find in the outside world. Most of the martial artists are here seeking luck. They hope to break through to the Grandmaster realm. Of course, within the walls of this city, a Grandmaster is not actually called a Grandmaster. They are simply called warriors, a title meant to humble them. Anyone below that level is merely referred to as a martial practitioner. Though Huanling City is vast, it is perfectly organized. The eastern district connects to the mountains and is protected by a massive spirit array. This is where the spiritual energy is most abundant, making it the primary hub for cultivators and high-level warriors. The southern district is different. It is inhabited by the blood relatives of the Huanling sect members. Land here is worth its weight in gold, and several great clans have emerged. These clans are essentially an extension of the sect's power. To the north, we find the taverns, gambling dens, and brothels, the city's most indulgent corner. There are even specialized pavilions offering services exclusively for cultivators. The Western District, however, is a chaotic melting pot of the mundane world. All sorts of shady characters gather there, from petty thieves to unlicensed vendors. The 4 districts are strictly divided by clear boundaries. Huanling sect disciples guard every crossing. To move between districts, one must report and receive a token. Crossing illegally is a grave mistake. If caught, you are sent directly to the mines for 10 years of hard labor. These mines never see the sun, and the tunnels are filled with toxic fumes. For those with mere mortal bodies, whether they would ever come out alive is a very big question. We turn now to a noisy street in the north. In a quiet corner, a long queue has formed in front of a small shop. The men waiting range from 16-year-olds to those in their twilight years. Curiously, they are all men, and most wear masks to hide their faces. A banner flutters in front of the shop, displaying bold, eye-catching characters. It boasts of a 1,000-year family medical legacy and the power to restore a man's vitality. To be honest, the marketing is quite direct. The sign reads, "Do not be a soft persimmon. If you want to be a man, you must be a truly hard man." It seems some problems are universal, regardless of whether one lives in an immortal city or a mortal village. The crowd stares at the shop curtain with desperate longing. After a short wait, a middle-aged man in a long robe slowly steps out to greet them. The man steps out with a bold, majestic stride, looking like a fierce tiger surveying his territory, radiating a newfound sense of overwhelming self-confidence. A calm voice calls out for the next person from the inner room. Upon hearing it, the burly man at the front of the line hurriedly lifts the curtain and squeezes inside. The man greets the doctor with a face full of smiles, praising Chu Zheng's acupuncture skills as the most miraculous he has ever witnessed in his life. He claims his body is getting stronger by the day. Chu Zheng sets down his teacup and casually asks how many times the man has visited. The man replies it is his third time. Chu Zheng nods, tells him this should be enough, and gestures for him to lie down on the nearby soft couch. Chu Zheng picks up a silver needle. He notes that while the man's vitality is slightly depleted, it is nothing that a quick repair cannot fix. He places needles in a few minor acupuncture points, waits a moment to open his repair panel, and then gently flicks the needles before withdrawing them. He announces it is finished and requests 2 low-grade spirit stones. The burly man stands up, stretches his limbs, and looks noticeably more vibrant. With profuse thanks, the man immediately produces the spirit stones and offers them with both hands. Chu Zheng takes them and casually tosses them in his palm. In this city, ordinary gold and silver are useless. Everyone uses spirit coins issued by the Huanling sect for their daily transactions. 100 spirit coins can be exchanged for a single low-grade spirit stone at sect exchange points, but Chu Zheng refuses coins and only accepts stones. To put that in perspective, an average worker in the city earns maybe 30 coins a month. Saving for a single stone would take nearly a year. We recall that after arriving at the city, Chu Zheng didn't rush into the sect. Instead, he sent Fu Quanliang ahead to join first while he waited outside. A full month has passed since then. The fact that no news has arrived is actually a good sign. It means Quanliang entered the sect without any issues. Opening this medical clinic was an idea Chu Zheng got from observing Quanliang. Back at the Song family, the man had suffered from quite a bit of overindulgence. Chu Zheng had used his repair ability to fix the man's injuries and, in the process, replenished his depleted vitality. It was a revelation, really. After learning the layout of Huanling City, Chu Zheng decided to set up shop right here in this busy district to put his unique skills to use. He even used marketing slogans from his past life to attract customers. Unsurprisingly, business began booming almost immediately. Being surrounded by brothels means his clients are usually wealthy men with status who have plenty of spirit coins but very little physical energy left. Using his panel to earn spirit stones is incredibly profitable and costs him almost nothing. However, Chu Zheng remains very careful not to draw unwanted attention. He avoids repairing these men's bodies all at once, usually splitting the treatment into 2 or 3 sessions, especially for those wealthy, gullible clients. For the truly rich, Chu Zheng might even stretch it to 7 or 8 gradual sessions to maximize his gains. In just 1 month, he has already accumulated a staggering amount of wealth, enough to make any cultivator green with envy. As he calls for the next patient, a figure lifts the curtain and steps inside. "Long time no see, Dr. Chu." Chu Zheng glances at the visitor and immediately announces to the waiting crowd that the clinic is closing early today. He steps outside to dismiss the remaining people, who leave with heavy sighs of disappointment. After all, most who come here are hiding their faces due to rather embarrassing ailments. No one dares to cause a scene, as a scandal here would mean total social ruin. In the blink of an eye, the space before the clinic is empty. Once the door is shut, Chu Zheng doesn't even wait for Fu Quanliang to speak before questioning him. He asks why it took so long and how the matter with the Song family was handled. Quanliang sighs, asking if he thinks leaving the sect is as easy as a magic trick. Every departure requires an elder's signed permit. He explains that he only managed to slip away this time by fighting for a specific mission assignment. Fu Quanliang explains his predicament with a helpless look, adding that the elder only briefly questioned how he managed to complete the task. He had claimed he hired several warriors to help in secret, using spiritual talismans to wound the target before they all joined forces to finish the job. When Quanliang stops there, Chu Zheng can't hide his surprise. He asks if the sect actually believed such a story. Quanliang is momentarily speechless. He asks what else Chu Zheng expected. For a mere outer disciple to even be questioned by an inner sect elder like Qing Ling is already an incredible exception. While this achievement has earned him some newfound respect among the other outer disciples, his fundamental situation hasn't actually changed at all. A low-grade talent is still just a low-grade talent. He still has to grind through missions to survive. Chu Zheng then casually asks about the cause of death. He wants to know if the details of Song Lingqing's death have been cleared up. Hearing this, Fu Quanliang freezes for a second and then shakes his head violently. No, he isn't dead. In fact, Quanliang has heard that it is Elder Qin Feng who is currently the one drifting closer to death's door. Chu Zheng is visibly stunned to hear he survived. Quanliang clarifies that while he's alive, he might as well not be, as his meridians were completely destroyed. His immortal bones are shattered, and he only has a single breath of life left, which Elder Qin Feng is desperately struggling to maintain. The sect has spent a fortune to save him, even using secret pills and ancient spiritual herbs, but so far, they have only managed to keep him breathing. They saved his life, but couldn't preserve his immortal bone, leaving his status in the sect quite awkward, a true disciple in name, but a useless man in reality. Now, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of inner disciples eager to replace him. After all, being a true disciple is a position of immense prestige. They enjoy protection from elders, mentorship from grandmasters, and endless resources, truly the kind of power that can turn clouds into rain with a single hand. They are the future pillars of the Huanling sect, but Song Lingqing no longer has the talent to match the title. He is simply occupying a space he can't use. It is only a matter of time before he is pushed out. We can see his fall from grace is imminent, and he might not even keep his status as an inner disciple. He might fall all the way to the bottom. Chu Zheng sighs, realizing that such a fate is hardly different from death itself. No wonder the pavilion slowed its pace. The Yeguang Pavilion has eased its pressure on the Song family. Strictly speaking, Chu Zheng only met Song Lingqing once, when the man helped him open a door. It was the first door to this world, but alas, life is unpredictable. Chu Zheng pulls his thoughts back and casually asks if there is news about him joining the sect. Initially, he didn't know that places like Huanling City existed outside the sect. Now, his obsession with joining the sect has faded significantly. One can touch the immortal path just as well in the city. Fu Quanliang mentions that the sect plans to recruit a batch of laborers from the city soon. Fu Quanliang answers with a sigh, but then his tone shifts. He suggests that Chu Zheng should wait a bit longer, which naturally leads to the question, why? Chu Zheng is puzzled. It turns out this batch of laborers is for the Han family, specifically for an ancient mining operation they are preparing. The site is an old battlefield from tens of thousands of years ago, buried with countless bones. It is incredibly dangerous. Fu Quanliang looks rather proud of himself. This is inside information, after all. Unless one has connections, an ordinary outer disciple would never know. Chu Zheng asks how many years ago he said. Naturally, Fu Quanliang doesn't need to pay spirit stones for himself, but he can't bring others for free. Chu Zheng's share must be paid. That is the rule. One should save where possible and spend where necessary, as spirit stones will be in high demand later. Chu Zheng remains unmoved and signals for the payment. A single spirit stone is worth an entire Song family. He still remembers Fu Quanliang's old metaphor. To be honest, it is not a small sum at all. Fu Quanliang is speechless, but hands over 2 low-grade spirit stones to his fellow disciples. They will stay here for 2 days as they enter the East City. Immediately, Chu Zheng senses a difference. The spiritual energy between heaven and earth surges, making the essence within his own body become far more active. After circulating his energy for a moment, Chu Zheng is quietly amazed. His cultivation speed here is at least nearly double what it was in the outside world. And this is only the edge of the Huanling sect. We can only imagine how much denser the spiritual energy must be within the sect's inner sanctum. Since it was still early, Chu Zheng found a bustling street corner to set up a small stall, planting a banner that read, "Recycling Old Magic Tools." To be honest, the profit from flipping magic tools is far more terrifying than running a medical clinic. Most discarded tools are seen as worthless. Because they are engraved with complex arrays, most of the materials cannot be recycled or reused. In the eyes of others, they are basically just scrap metal. Even the lowest grade magic tool costs at least 500 to 800 spirit stones, but once his panel repairs them, the value skyrockets. It is a profit of at least 100-fold. Meanwhile, Fu Quanliang had his own tasks to attend to after descending from the mountain. After squatting on the street with Chu Zheng for an hour, he took his leave. With business being slow, Chu Zheng decided to multitask. He pulled up his repair panel and used all of his daily attempts on the Xiantian seal. We see his current status. Chu Zheng, first tier cultivation. His techniques include the Great Zhao Heaven Qi outline at the 6th tier, though it remains incomplete, and the 4th tier Dragon Tiger body. Then there is the Xiantian seal, a 5th tier divine ability, alongside his 1st tier skills like turning stone to gold and the invisibility technique. His repairer rank sits at the 1st tier, with 231,000 experience points, and his daily repair attempts are now at 0. Currently, the Xiantian seal requires more work, as does the Great Zhao Heaven Qi outline, which still needs over 1,000 points to complete. The Dragon Tiger body is also halfway there. At this rate, it will take another 20 days before the Xiantian seal is fully restored. The Xiantian seal is one of the 5 ancient divine abilities, and Chu Zheng has always been quite fascinated by its potential. It truly piqued his interest. Just like his artifact refining method, these 5 paths once led to the very peak of human cultivation. They were legendary, in other words. Why these 5 paths withered away remains a great mystery. If Li Mingzhou hadn't thrown that fragment into the sea, he might have solved it. Whenever he thinks of that lost opportunity, he feels a genuine pang of regret. It was a wasted chance to uncover the truth early. Most people simply melt down damaged magic tools to erase all traces before discarding them or hiding them away in some dusty chest. After all, these tools often retain the lingering scent and traces of their former owners, which could be dangerous if found by the wrong person. Remote curses or tracking spells are always a possibility, so Chu Zheng sat on the street for nearly 4 hours. He only managed 2 deals, both from the same person, a set of Qingling robes that looked recently unearthed. With his sharp eyes, he could tell they were stripped from a corpse. The panel confirmed they were reparable. Then there were the cloud-chasing boots, which had likely traveled more miles than most people walk in a millennium. Having passed through 5 owners, the soles were worn through, but they were still reparable for a small fee. If not for the panel's prompt, Chu Zheng wouldn't have noticed anything wrong with the robes, despite the large tear. The spiritual arrays were shattered, and Chu Zheng felt a bit disappointed that they had been washed so thoroughly. The cleaning had erased the history of the garment, while the boots were in even worse shape, missing half a sole. They looked ancient and weathered, which, strangely enough, was exactly the kind of thing Chu Zheng preferred. He paid 40 spirit coins for each, totaling less than 1 low-grade stone, and decided to keep them with him. Since the mine he was heading to wasn't inside the main mountain range, the inspections wouldn't be quite so strict. Storage bags were forbidden, but 2 pieces of junk wouldn't draw any eyes. Just then, a voice called out. The stranger asked if he was buying, and when Chu Zheng looked up, he was genuinely surprised by what he saw. Standing before him was a youth of about 16 or 17, not much younger than Chu Zheng's actual age. The boy was thin and wore a faded blue robe, carrying the distinct, scholarly air of someone who spent years reading. He was the first true scholar Chu Zheng had encountered here, and more importantly, the boy was a mere mortal. He hadn't practiced a lick of martial arts, which made his presence in the Eastern District rather peculiar. Usually, this area is filled with cultivators and martial masters. You almost never see an ordinary person here. The youth held a long wooden box with both hands, his expression flickering with a touch of hesitation and shyness. Chu Zheng didn't hesitate, reaching out to take the box from the young man's hands to see what was inside. Inside the box lay a wooden sword, or what was left of one, with the tip and half the blade missing entirely.